The Bear Orr's special edition series, Bandwidth, serves as a platform to celebrate the people and stories of Dan's book, Bandwidth, the untold story of ambition, deception, and innovation that shaped the internet age and the dot-com boom. The story covers the epic journey of the creation of the internet backbones, the building of the early competitive fiber networks in the 1990s, the bandwidth boom, bust, and resurrection, ending in 2020 when Dan's company, Zayo, was sold. The book is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Head to dan-caruso.com/book for more details. In this episode of The Bear Roars, Dan sits down with Dave Schaeffer, founder and CEO of Cogent Communications, and one of the most unconventional success stories in telecom. Dave started college at age 12 and ran a DC taxicab empire before founding one of the world's most successful internet infrastructure companies. He shares how his journey led him to build Cogent on a simple but radical idea, building a network focused solely on internet. Dan and Dave dig into Cogent's unique strategy, how they survived the dot-com crash, and why picking one lane and executing relentlessly has paid off for over 2 decades. Let's poke the bear to kick off the conversation.
Dave Schaeffer, it's been a long time since we caught up, and I'm really looking forward to understanding your broader history, even before telecom and how you got there and the whole story of Cogent. But how you been?
I've been good, Dan. You're looking good, and I appreciate you hosting me today.
Absolutely. This is we're here in Columbia Capital, which was one of my key investors over the years, worked with them across multiple different investments, including the 2 that I was CEO of. So unfortunately, most of my close associates are not here. I'm having dinner with one tonight, but the rest of them are out of town. But thank you, Columbia Capital, for letting us use your offices here for a couple podcast recordings.
And I was in the old office about 3 blocks from here, but have not had the opportunity to be in this new office. So it looks great.
Yeah, it is a nice office. So tell us, what are you up to now? Let's start with the present, and we'll go back to the past. So what are you up to now? What is Cogent up to? What's the current state of the industry before we look backwards in time?
Boy, those are a lot of questions, Dan.
Yes.
So, Cogent survived in what has been a turbulent industry and I think has actually thrived by being very narrow in its focus. I think many companies get in trouble when they try to deviate from their core competencies. And, Cogent began its life with the premise that the internet would be the only network that would matter. And we needed to be very focused on being the most efficient operator in that space. And if you listen to the pundits, they'll tell you to try to sell a wide variety of products. But at Cogent, we actually started as a single product company.
Yeah, I developed this thesis that I called the scope and scale paradox, and I would always use Cogent as one of the prime examples. And the scope and scale paradox of telecom was this notion that to really make money on a network, you needed scale. So you needed a network to be, the bigger, the better. But then there was a scope. You needed to do a lot of things in your network. You needed all kinds of layers of services. So by that notion, you would think those who had scale and scope would be the ones that would have been most successful. The ones who had tons of products to offer to tons of different markets, all leveraging kind of their vast network. But in reality, what we saw was something very different. What we saw is companies who, like Cogent, kind of picked their lane and said, I'm going to be really successful at a piece of that, and I'll build slowly from there. Cogent being one of the best examples, certainly in your category, but in Equinix was a great example in colo, because it wasn't preordained that to be successful as a colo provider, that you should focus just on colo. Earlier on, the idea was colo was going to be a line of business alongside a bunch of other things. Akamai for CDNs. Certainly when we did Zayo, we took that theory of focusing just on kind of fundamental bandwidth. So what you did helped influence kind of how I tried to dissect what's it really going to take to be successful in this business. And you got to look past kind of the textbook of, hey, the more products you have, the more shared costs, the more efficient you are. It's like, yeah, maybe in a textbook, but in practice, if that was true, how does Cogent exist? How does Cogent exist not just for a short period of time, but for now, 2 decades?
25 years.
25 years. So we're going to learn kind of how maybe an unorthodox approach has produced a ton of success.
Yeah, well, if you go back to the beginning, Cogent had 6 basic pillars to its business model. Bandwidth would be a commodity, and in order to survive, you had to be the lowest cost producer. 2, you needed to get scale quickly to your thesis around you needed to have breadth. 3, local access is a natural monopoly, and as an overbuilder, which anyone other than an incumbent is, you needed to be very selective about where you deployed network. 4th, you needed to have a lower cost of revenue acquisition. And the easiest way to do that is by delivering a compelling value to the customer. 5th, you needed to be able to take advantage of changes in technology more effectively than others. And then finally, you needed to have the products and services and legacy businesses migrating to your platform. And by structurally separating the application from the network, the internet did what regulators spent 40 years trying to do and failed, which is separate the network layer from the application layer.
Yep. And here you are describing this as if when you came up with this thesis, it was based on kind of years of experience in this industry. But when Cogent started, you weren't from this industry. Is that correct? What were you doing before you started Cogent?
Well, fair enough. I am a very lucky person. I don't think I've ever had a real job in my life. And I've had the...
As a public company CEO, you have a real job.
Well, I get to do what I want to do and get to have a fair amount of say on what I do each day. And, I grew up here in the D.C. area. Actually, never came to Alexandria very much when I was younger. I was on the other side, on the Maryland side of the river. Actually, my office today is literally 2 blocks from the hospital I was born in.
Wow.
And I've lived in this area my whole life. I was lucky enough to go to school when I was really young and just study a lot of different things. I actually thought I was going to be...
When you say you went to school when you were really young, we all went to school when we were young. What do you mean by that? What's different about your experience?
I was in college when I was 12, and I was working my PhD when I was 14.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember this. We were at a dinner once that I hosted in Boulder, and there were about 8 of us CEO types there. And I went around the table and I asked people who is the smartest person they know in the industry. And I went last because I knew what my answer was. My answer was Dave Schaeffer.
I must have fooled you, Dad.
You're at a IQ level that is beyond most of the rest of us. And I don't think I don't think most people understand that and know that, at least people within the industry that I would know. I mean, you're just, your level of kind of just pure IQ is at a different level.
Well, thank you for that compliment.
And so you were in college. So go through it again. You were in college at what age? And
I grew up. I went to public high school. I skipped a bunch of grades, took a bunch of tests. And actually, the toughest thing about being in college was I had to take public transport to get to and from the University of Maryland. And I got accepted into some Ivy League schools, but elected to stay at home for a couple of reasons. One, I didn't think I was ready to live on my own. 2, I could not afford a lot of those schools and would have ended up with debt. And at the time, Maryland had a great program. You could register for $349 a semester, and there was no limit on the number of courses you took. So we were a typical kind of semester system, 2 courses. Typical course was 3 credit hours. And I was actually able to take about 40 credits a semester, which was about double the maximum
At
normal
what age?
load.
At what
I
age?
was 12.
So at 12, you're in college and you're taking double the course load of, I remember trying to get away with only taking 13 hours, during some of my semesters when I was trying to get through engineering. If I'd have taken 18 hours, I wouldn't have gotten through, let alone 40.
Well, and it was an interesting loophole in the way the structure was written, which was you could actually take graduate courses as an undergrad as long as you met the prerequisites, and you didn't have to pay the graduate rate, which was much higher. And I was lucky enough, again, to be able to take mostly graduate courses by taking tests. And I actually was threatened with expulsion from school because I was taking 40 hours of graduate course for $349. And I actually got called into the president of the university's office and told I needed to become a grad student and pay the full freight. And that was not a good fact.
So where did this intelligence come from? Were your parents unusually intelligent?
Well, they were smart people. My mom and dad never went to college. My dad was a cab driver and eventually had a small taxicab company, which we'll get to in a moment,
yes.
And kind of explain how I got into business. And, I guess I got my start. I had a brother that was 11 years older than me, and he liked to let me do his homework for him. So I was able to read his books and teach myself how to do things, and pretty much was doing homework that someone 11 years older would do, and it just gave me a foundation to learn.
As you look back now, how do you explain that? How do you explain, to yourself, how would you explain to us how you were able to absorb so much at such a young age and have kind of the drive to do that, the passion to do that? That is, I can't think of anyone else I know throughout my entire life that, had a similar experience.
I don't think I ever was a kid. I kind of always functioned as an adult. And I saw my dad, who literally worked 7 days a week to support us. I had two brothers, a sister. My mom didn't have a paying job. She was, a homemaker. And, we all lived in a fairly modest house with one bathroom. And I don't know, I just started working and it just came naturally to me and really continued to just love learning.
Yep. So when did you finish your college, graduate school set of experiences? Did that come to an end, or did you sort of blend work and go into school together at some point?
A little bit of both. So I did work part-time while I was going to school in the evening sometimes and on weekends. And what had happened was I had written my dissertation. I had taken my comprehensive exams to get a PhD, but had not formally defended my dissertation, which is the last step. And my dad called me up to come and see him at work. And it was actually a call I kind of dreaded because I knew what it was. And he had managed to get himself pretty far financially underwater, and he needed some help. And I did not end up defending my dissertation and went in and started working with him, turning that business around.
So this is, what age are you at this point?
So I'm 17.
You're 17.
My dad had gone from being an independent cab driver to actually having a small company of 49 cabs, running it out of a one-bay gas station. And this would have been 1973. And he was about $1 million upside down.
Which is a lot of money in
Oh, it's
1973.
a huge amount of money for a guy who didn't have a lot of money. And he asked myself and my two older brothers to come in and help him.
And before we go there, when you said defending your dissertation, what does that mean?
Okay, so you pick a thesis topic that you would like to write on. You're typically assigned a thesis advisor who will guide you. After you take a number of requisite courses and you have sufficient credit, you're expected to publish a independent thought piece that contributes to whatever field you're in. And you pick that topic. You typically write a document. Mine was about 250 pages long. And that process usually lasts a couple of years. I did mine relatively quickly. And I was actually taking some
What was your
courses.
topic?
My topic was actually the impact of technological change on social stability in Eastern Europe in the 17th century.
In the 17th century. All right. Well, we're not going to just drop it there. What was the impact of technological change in Eastern Europe and the 17th century?
So it turns out there's kind of an
Defended
optimal,
right here.
Yeah. So there's an optimal rate of technological change for social stability. And England, at the same time, with the Industrial Revolution, had, by luck, kind of hit that optimal rate of adoption of new technologies that allowed it to catapult its rate of economic growth past Netherlands, which was the richest country per capita at the time. In Eastern Europe, there was actually a deep base of scientific knowledge, mostly in what is now Germany, the eastern part of Germany around Wittenberg. And the issue was that adopting that technology was too threatening to the governmental structures that were in place. They then instituted a number of repressive reactions that allowed scientific research to continue, but not to be able to commercialize that research. And that resulted in Germany falling behind England for nearly 200 years.
Interesting. And do you see any parallels in today's society to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's, you always have to be conscious of the impact of technology on people's lives. And, people who are against technology are often referred to as Luddites. That was Ned Ludd in England, who went around breaking machines because he thought it put people out of work. And the reality is, technological change is disruptive, but it actually creates more jobs than it destroys. And I think, we've already seen one round of disruption with the internet, and we'll probably see another round of similar disruption with the adoption of AI, which will, I think, be as impactful as the internet in transforming people's lives and the rate of economic growth. I mean, there are two words for the same thing. One is very positive. The other is usually considered negative. The positive term is progress. The negative term is deflation. And a lot of people fear that and the disruption that comes with it, but it can be managed correctly.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, fantastic. So your dad's got $1 million in debt. He approaches you and your two older brothers and says what?
Says, can you come and help me? And I literally still have the image in my mind. I remember pulling into his gas station. He was changing a tire on a car, and he said, we need to talk. And he knew that I was still in school. My two brothers both had small businesses that were kind of really mom and pop, and they were lifestyle businesses that were struggling. And, I couldn't say no. I came in, and within about 3 years, turned that business around and grew it to a little over 2,000 cabs and was hugely cash flow positive.
And you said at the time you got involved, he had about 50
about
cabs?
50 cars.
So you went from 50 to
almost 2,100.
2,100 in between ages of 17 and
about 20.
20. Okay.
And quite honestly, I was making more money than I ever expected to make in my life. I had a nice condo. I had nice cars. I was working hard and, was not going to go back to teaching or thinking about becoming a teacher. I never really was a teacher.
Was that your aspiration? Was you thought you were on a path to
I
be
just
a teacher?
I just thought I would be in academia. And, my undergrad degree was actually in physics, and I just took different subject matters that interested me. And ultimately, I chose economics, not because I was particularly enamored with it, but because I didn't have to do lab work as a graduate student, so I could be more efficient in learning. And I just thought I'd end up as an econ professor somewhere, writing some books. And, I started in business, was able to be very successful. And, from that, looked at other growth opportunities. I actually ran that business day to day for 17 years.
Wow. For 17 years.
Hard business, awful business.
Yes. But a business where every dollar matters, efficiency matters, understanding change matters, understanding people matter because you got to have,
people
the
is what
details of running a business. If you weren't on top of details, you can't be successful in a business like that.
It was a nickel and dime business. And listen, you learn to negotiate very quickly when you repossess a car from a guy who's 3 times your size and he was living in that car and that's all he had in the world. And you took that away from him. And, you had to understand what motivated people, what were their dynamics. You had to watch your costs, and you had to understand the structural opportunities and impediments. And, the industry in DC was interesting. It was the second largest cab market in the country. It was completely deregulated on the vehicle side. So there were no medallions. There was an unlimited supply of vehicles, but there was actually a limitation on the number of drivers. So it created the most challenging economic construct. And you had to quickly realize your customer was not the person riding in the cab, but the cab driver.
Mm.
And we're able to grow that business. We ultimately controlled about 45% of the market. And politically, that was probably the limit of how far we could go. In a city that was minority governed at the time and living in the suburbs at that time, it just was not practical to control directly more than 45% of the industry.
So give us some stories from those 17 years. Like, give us some juicy stories where things didn't go the way you wanted to go, hurdles you had to overcome, maybe confrontations or negotiations that are particularly memorable. Give us some color on what you had to deal with.
I remember having a meeting with the then mayor of DC, Marion Barry, who was kind of infamous. He ultimately was convicted on a drug offense. And I go into his office. He's eating chicken. There's kind of like grease running down his face. And my 2 brothers were with me. And he said, this has been historically a minority industry, and it provided a pathway for people to work their way up and oftentimes drive a cab part-time while they held government jobs. And at that time, most of the government jobs were unofficially segregated, if not officially. And these were lower level people.
And what do you mean segregated?
Meaning minorities would have janitorial jobs or support functions, but would not be in a policy-making role in some agency. We had people driving cabs who were butlers at the White House or cooks for the Supreme Court, in these support functions. And here we were, three white guys who were making a lot of money off of the backs of these minorities. And it was just not something that I think was politically correct. And, the mayor just said, look, I'll leave you alone if, this is as far as you go. But if you intend to totally take over the industry, there'll be a set of regulatory changes that won't work in your favor. He wasn't quite that articulate in the way he said it. And
he got the message across, though.
Loud and clear. And at that point, we pivoted and started taking indirect control of the industry. So the first thing we did is started to buy the real estate that our competitors sat on. And cabs tended to have an interesting need for real estate, large lots, typically close in downtown, that were building poor. And they would pay minimal rent, but it would be enough that you could speculatively hold that land until neighborhoods changed. And we bought real estate under which virtually all of our competitors sat, and that thesis turned out to be correct. We had property where the first DC Convention Center was built. We had property where the second DC Convention Center was built, and just a number of very land-rich, building-poor, covered land plays that turned out well. Ultimately, we did 47 of those transactions. We still own 5 of those, my 2 brothers and myself. And then, the others have all been divested. One was the largest single land assemblage ever done in D.C. It was about 16 acres.
So what was the relationship between you and your brothers during this period of taking over the taxicab business and doing these real estate plays?
No, I think it was very constructive. I mean, we all grew up together. It was a little weird that I was functioning as the CEO and I was the youngest.
How did it turn out that you were functioning as the CEO?
Pretty much all of the strategic decisions, ended up being ones that I made. And my brothers were comfortable. They all worked hard. They were willing to work a little bit less than I was. They were all happy with the compensation we got. And, How
hard were you willing to work in those days?
I worked 7 days a week, probably 12 to 14 hours a day.
Yeah, no,
it was really hard work. And I really disliked the cab business. And we did start one more business together, and that was we started a property and casualty underwriter, first to insure our own cabs, since that was the largest single expense we had. But then it ultimately grew to insure about 90% of the market for cabs, limousines, couriers, and ambulances in the tri-state area, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. And when my dad decided to retire, his health wasn't very good. I took that opportunity to retire as well. And that was an interesting process. It took probably a year and a half to negotiate. And I needed to be very conscious of the needs of each of my brothers. And I had the good fortune, outside of those 3 businesses, of doing my first technology business on my own.
So let's come there in a little bit. Tell me about the relationship between you and your dad during this period where you come into business, you work alongside him. Is that the right way to think about it over these 17 years? You characterize yourself as kind of the de facto CEO, but your dad presumably was CEO on paper. Like, how did that all work? That's a complex situation.
It is a complex
Not too many
situation.
father, son, brother situations could get through that.
We all got along pretty well. I think my dad was grateful of the progress we had made. And, I think he had his area of focus. He was much more of a people person and really interacted day to day with the cab drivers and was almost their friend in many ways. And I was probably more the cold-hearted business person behind the scenes, making decisions. But, ultimately it's about getting consensus with your partners and coming up with a strategy that works. And, it all worked pretty well. Probably the biggest tension came when I wanted to leave, and my two brothers pretty vehemently argued for me not to leave. And in that negotiation, we ended up giving my middle brother a fairly large cash stipend, and he really hasn't worked since. My oldest brother, we downsized the cab business and built it more as something he could pass on to his children as a legacy business. And then I literally just left on my own to start something new. And I had capital. And as I was starting to say, I had done one other venture while I was still part of the cab business, but my brothers elected not to be partners with me in that. And that was the specialized mobile radio business, or SMR, and actually met Mark Warner at Columbia back in those days.
Because Mark Warner, the senator, was Columbia Capital. Founded Columbia Capital. I've never met Mark Warner because by the time I got involved with Columbia Capital, he was, already in politics, and I don't know what his exact relationship was. The investments I was involved with Columbia were some of their best performing investments in the history of the firm. The ICG one was very important to them when it happened. It was a big outcome in a short period of time, and Zayo was probably their biggest outcome in history. Yet through all of that, and then we did some stuff in Europe together. Through all of that, never have been introduced to Mark Warner. So if Columbia Capital, if you guys are listening to this, which I'm sure you will, hopefully at some point get an opportunity to meet him.
Well, Mark was a real gentleman. He came from a regulatory background and had really founded Columbia more as a spectrum aggregator for cellular licenses. And then the firm eventually morphed into a true venture firm. And Mark first left to run for governor, served one term, and in Virginia, you can't succeed yourself. So you're one term limited. And he then pivoted and ran for the Senate and became senator and has served in that role ever since. And actually, I think the partner you've worked with most, John Siegel, I had actually met John many years after this when John was at Morgan Stanley Capital Partners and actually never interacted with him after he came over to Columbia.
So you were getting involved in, before we get a little bit deeper into the radio, what's happening with the cab business now? Is it still in the family?
Yeah. It's still there. My oldest brother, who is 79, he'll be 80 in a few months, goes to the office most days. It's much smaller. It's a couple hundred cabs. And it's just something to get out of the house.
And, and you mentioned most of the land and real estate that you guys gathered, and most of that's been sold off. There's still a few properties left. Tell us what the current status of that business is.
Yeah, so I actually have two very different real estate businesses. So the first one was this one that we did in partnership with my brothers, where we did a total of 47 covered land plays. And probably in total, that property represented maybe 75, 80 acres of land in DC, which is a small geography. And, they were all sold off one at a time. One became a McDonald's, one became a bank branch, a couple became strip centers, some became hotels, apartment buildings. But they were all very close to downtown and were prime for redevelopment.
And how would you characterize how they did as investments between when you bought them and when you sold them?
So I remember the first deal we did together would have been in 1976. And we bought a piece of land that another cab company was on. It was an acre and a quarter, right across the street from what at the time was Uline Arena, which is where the Beatles had their first concert in America. The neighborhood had gone down. It was kind of on the wrong side of the train tracks. We bought that property for $350,000 with $50,000 down payment and a $300,000 owner take back from an estate, and held that property till 92 when we sold it for, I think, $2.7 million. So about a 9X on the face, but we only had $50,000 in it. And we quickly pulled that out. And that property ultimately was resold for nearly $40 million about a decade after we sold it, and now has a condo development on it, residential condo. But we did very well. I mean, we all made far more money than we expected. And, the assets that we have left are ones that are probably still in more developing areas. They'll eventually be sold off. And I pivoted in real estate without my brothers to do something different, which for 30 years was great, and the last couple of years has not been. And that is, I started buying office buildings in downtown DC. I own 42 office buildings, about 3.3 million square feet, and have a dedicated real estate management firm that runs that portfolio day to day for me. About 550 tenants, 3.3 million square feet, and a diverse set of assets along K Street, L Street. So think of it as a central business district, kind of like Walnut would be in Boulder, prime locations. And up until COVID, that had been a great strategy.
Yep. So not everything that you've touched has turned and stayed complete gold, but for the most part it has. What about the insurance business?
Insurance business did well. So, we started that business de novo in 79, I believe. And I remember going in to the superintendent of insurance in DC saying, I want to start an insurance company. I went and got the regulations, read them, and I walked into the office. Nobody knew how to do it. The last insurance company that had been started in DC was Geico in 1937, and no one had done that for 42 years. And I said, well, here are the rules. Here are my checks. I'd like to get started. And it took a while to get someone to eventually accept the application. started it. And at the time, it was capitalized with $1.5 million, $750,000 of initial capitalization, and $750,000 of additional paid-in surplus. That business grew very rapidly and grew to doing about $25 million a year in premiums. And I was actually in favor of expanding that beyond the limited product set and limited geography, but it would have required bringing in outside capital because we were too thinly capitalized to get a sufficient AM Best rating to be able to write in other states. So my two brothers just didn't want to be involved with outside investors. So we just kept the business pretty much at that scale, and it still exists today.
Gotcha. Okay, so now let's move on. Now you're starting to kind of creep closer to what you ended up doing with Cogent. So tell us about this radio business.
Yeah, so the first foray into technology was actually to get two-way radios for taxicabs. And Motorola had a direct distribution model and did not support dealers. They elected to pivot in their land mobile business to a dealer model, and I got the dealership for this region and started selling radios not only to ourselves but to other cab companies. And it was a relatively thin margin business where you made money three ways. You made some money on the sale, you made some money on the repairs, and you had a leasing component for those that couldn't pay up front. And that worked out reasonably well. But along the way, a lot of smaller radio dealers were starting community repeaters. And those were kind of shared spectrum for tow trucks or ambulances where you had an open hoot and holler circuit on spectrum that was shared by others, typically operated in the UHF band, which meant between 450 and 490, actually 470, and 490 was added later in the T-band. And there was no proprietary spectral rights. But being in the right place at the right time, the government decided to make a new band of spectrum available in the 800 megahertz directly adjacent to the two cellular licenses, the A and B blocks, that were given out directly by the FCC. So the A block was always given to the independent, to the
phone company,
ILEC in that market, and the B block was independent operators who had to prove the wherewithal to build. And how Mark actually got started, Mark Warner, is he literally drove around, found doctors and dentists who would pledge to build the B system out. He would then get the license based off of their balance sheet and eventually flip those to the roll-ups that came from the non-incumbent telcos out of territory. And then what I was involved in was 800 megahertz trunking, or SMR, specialized mobile radio. And again, you look for an unfair competitive advantage. That was that you had to load the spectrum, and then you would be given property rights to the spectrum. And the rule was you had 5 years to put 70 users per channel, and you could trunk 5, and then ultimately it was modified to 10 channels together to create something like a private cellular system. And the, trick I used was through my radio dealership, I went around the country to other cab operators, offered them free radios and free computer-aided dispatch systems in exchange for them loading the spectrum for me, I would then peel off a portion of the spectrum for them to keep, trunk the remaining channels, and then flip those channels to what became Nexttel.
Gotcha.
So I did that all around the country and, never really operated the systems as a business, but really as a spectrum arbitrage. I ultimately did 180 channels of SMR, and my cost basis was $35 a channel. My average selling price was about $175,000 a channel.
And to connect some dots here, Nexttel was Craig McCaw.
Mm-hmm.
Craig McCaw created, I think it was the largest non-Arbach owned wireless network by buying up companies spectrum like yours.
Actually, Craig got involved in SMR later through Nexttel. So the history was...
Oh, that's right. His initial one was McCall Cellular.
Yeah, Craig's dad was in the cable business in Seattle. Craig got involved in buying small cellular systems in the B block and rolled up a number of those that he eventually sold to AT&T as McCaw Cellular.
I cover all this in the book, and here I am forgetting it, but yes.
That's okay. There were a lot of names in your book, Dan. And Craig then pivoted to the SMR business, but the SMR industry was primarily driven by Morgan O'Brien. So at the very beginning, Motorola had a position, and there were a couple of small regional operators. There was Pinton Creef out of Texas. There was Bill Decay out of South Carolina that ultimately became Vanguard Cellular.
And now, right?
And actually his son-in-law runs Conterra.
Yes.
Has since retired, Steve Leyland.
Yeah.
So that was Bill's son-in-law because he was partners with a paging operator as well that partnered with him. And then you had actually in Denver, where you live, Justin Joschke and Centennial rolled up a number of assets. And Morgan O'Brien started with a company called Discom. He merged that with Andy Deskalakis' company called Econ Radio, I think. And then they changed the name to Fleet Call. And Fleet Call became the dominant player. Fleet Call then received an investment from Craig McCaw and MCI and changed its name to Nexttel and hired Dan Ackerson to be CEO.
Okay, those are a lot of dots connected. And and tell me how John Kluge and Metro Media fit into that too, because didn't they buy the paging business?
Well, that's on the paging side. So this was non-paging. So this was specialized mobile radio. And having made a fair amount of money in the spectrum plays, I was keenly aware of it. The government changed the rules for paging. So prior to 1994, paging operated under Part 22 of the FCC and was regulated as a common carrier. The spectrum did not have property rights, and the equipment had to be owned by the carrier and leased to the subscriber. Those rules changed with the private carrier designation under Part 15 and a new band in the 900 megahertz spectrum was allocated for new paging carriers. I actually started a paging carrier from scratch in 94. I left the cab business, was probably 36, 37 at that time, and really didn't want to just not do anything. So
Was that presumably was a choice that was available to you? You probably had made a lot of money by that point.
So
Yes.
I did have the opportunity not to work. I was lucky enough, but I wanted to do something. And real estate was not a full-time job. It was an interesting investment, but not something I wanted to do full-time. And I started a paging carrier with a couple of different twists. So first of all, it was 100% subscriber-owned equipment. 2, it was all direct distribution rather than agents. And I actually opened up stores in regional shopping malls. This was long before there were cellular stores to distribute pagers. And I had 18 stores. I operated from Jersey, right outside of New York, down to Richmond, and grew the business to about 65 towers and about 60,000 subs. I structured it as a fairly tax-efficient structure where I actually leased the equipment to the subs with a penny buyout at the end, and that allowed me to strip the depreciation off of the subscriber equipment. And it was primarily targeted at minority markets. And I was courted to take that company public. John Kluge did own Metro Media Paging at that time. And there were other public paging companies. I did not believe it was a good enough company to raise public capital for, and I declined. Ultimately, I was approached to buy the company by 2 different public companies, and in the negotiation, I realized that there were different geographies that each of the buyers wanted. So what I did was bifurcated the business, sold half to one public company, Arch, the other half to PageNet, and exited without ever raising external capital for that business. And then
And what were those exits roughly worth at the time?
So probably I had invested about $1 million. I probably exited at about 12 million, but I had generated about 40 million of tax attributes that were more valuable than the exit. And I had to structure it so I didn't recapture my negative basis. And then
by the way, my idea, not that I'm going to write another book, because writing bandwidth was a lot of work.
Oh, I'm sure.
And it was it came out of passion and need. But if I do write another book, the idea for it just came in this conversation. Are you ready? The title is Spectrum. And it's going to be similar format, but where did all these cellular networks come from? How did we get to T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon? Because the stories that led to that was very similar.
Very similar.
Crazy pioneering entrepreneurs, mergers, acquisitions, bankruptcies along the way, probably some bad behavior along the way.
Some real palace intrigue with John Zieglitz at AT&T, and the spin out of wireless, and Craig McCaw's management team, which has a tangential relationship to Zayo.
Oh, of course.
Because of Jim Barksdale, who was CIO of FedEx and then left to be Craig McCaw's COO. And you had Rufus Lumry and Craig Baumgartner. You just had a real A-team of really strong entrepreneurs in that early McCaw roll-up. But, going back to, now I'm probably in my late 30s, but just about 40, again, unemployed and thinking about what I'm going to do. And my next idea was I'm going to go bid on C-Block PCS spectrum, which was a new cellular band that was being allocated to small businesses. So I literally, this was pre-internet. I got this big green book that was 1,000 pages, which were the bidding rules from the FCC. I read it and I said, okay, I think I could do this. And I put my application in, started the process of bidding, and quickly realized it was not for me because the other quote unquote small businesses were all backed by telephone companies. They were just fronts. And there was no way I would be able to compete with their access to capital and their scale. So I just said, no, this is not for me. And then I started a new business and my paths actually crossed again with Columbia Capital in that business. So in reading those rules, the government did something that was a little bit weird. They actually auctioned off spectrum that other people were using. And it was then the obligation of the purchaser to relocate those businesses to alternate spectrum. And the rules were unexecutable. And the reason was the way the BTAs and MTAs were set up straddled different fixed microwave paths. These were all used for fixed microwave. There were 4 types of users. There were state and local governments, railroads, pipelines, and electric utilities. And everybody wanted a new system, but all of the existing systems were analog. You could not replace a partial system with digital. You had to do all digital. But the problem was you had 6 different PCS bands, A through F, all with different auction dates, 2 different geographic overlays, and a 400 radius contour for interference. So each utility had to deal with multiple PCS winners that would come at different points in time. And I said, this is just unexecutable. Columbia ended up financing a company called Columbia Spectrum Management. CEO was a guy named Tom Stroop, who came from Telecator, which was the trade association for the paging industry. And their model was to charge a consulting fee to solve this problem for the incumbent operators. There was no money in a consulting business. So I created a company that would do the consulting for free, but would also fund the completion of a new digital system for the utility if they assigned their rights to me. And I could either elect to build fiber or microwave along their right-of-ways. And then the proceeds I would get through the negotiations would help offset that new build. And they would participate in a revenue share along with getting a new system. There were 493 of these organizations that were impacted. We were successful in signing 63 of them up, which was a totally new world for me in dealing with Fortune 100 companies. And I'll never forget going to Shell, meeting the president of Shell America. And he, I was in his office and he says, this is a really good deal for us. But he said, who are your backers? And I said, me. And he says, we just can't do business with me. We need institutional support. He said, if I go in front of my board and something blows up, I got to know the people behind it. And I thought about that on the plane ride back from Houston. And for the first time in my life, I took institutional capital, in large part just for credibility.
And who did you take it from?
So the original round was NEA, Spectrum Equities out of Boston, and TD Capital's Merchant Bank.
Okay, so serious
Serious
sources of money. Yeah.
Yeah, NEA, which is the largest venture firm in the world, was Peter Barris, who ran the firm, was on my board. And we took the money, we got the initial agreements, and the idea was to build fiber or microwave to secondary markets for LD bypass. So at the time, long distance termination was very expensive. In urban markets, it was tightly regulated. In very rural markets, the independent telcos were given a free hand, and they were typically charging termination rates that were 10 to 15 times what the RBOCs were charging. So it would cost 3 or 4 cents a minute to terminate in South Dakota, where you could terminate an LD call in New York for about a half a cent a minute. And at the time, LD was selling for, about 10 cents a minute. So the idea was to use these utility right-of-ways to build this bypass network. So we had 63 supply agreements, and then we had take-or-pay contracts with AT&T and MCI on the other side. But we actually never became revenue generating. We just had these two pools of contracts. And we did a public high-yield deal. We did a $350 million deal in 97. It was a 2-year pre-fund, 12.5% coupon at the holdco company level. I then took the $350 of proceeds, downflowed it to the operating company level, and ultimately put $3.1 billion of debt on to build the network. We were dramatically over-levered. Telecom market was on fire, to put it mildly.
Yeah. So 97, 98, right?
Oh, yeah. It didn't matter that you didn't have revenue.
The big boom, yeah.
Well, companies traded at 4.5 times the PP&E.
Yeah, so the amount you invest, amount of capital you put in the ground, somehow that means you're worth 3 or 4 times that amount was kind of the rule of thumb.
That's right.
Because, so the more you could raise, the more you could spend. For a short period of time, you're rewarded for that in the form of equity. Saying your company was worth a lot of money, multiples of what you raised. But, there was also expectation that that was going to turn at some point into cash flow, which obviously it didn't do.
Didn't work out too well for most of those folks. So we had started building network, had not yet become operational.
What was the name of the entity that was?
Pathnet.
Pathnet, okay.
We did have public debt, but not public equity out.
Yep.
We actually did a fully marketed roadshow. I'll get to that in a minute for the equity. And we pulled the deal because we tried to price the day after Russia defaulted on its debt. And the markets were shut. We were 7x oversubscribed on Tuesday, and by Thursday, we couldn't pull a book together. So what had happened was we had built the company. I was CEO, and I sat down with my investors. There was $36 million of equity and $3.4 billion of debt.
Go through let's say again. 36 million of equity and how much debt?
$3.4 billion.
That's just, it's hard to fathom how.
And this was in $98.
Yeah.
This would be $8 or $9 billion today.
Yeah. So you're sitting on billions of dollars of debt.
And we needed equity. So I went to the board and I said, we need equity. I said, well, let's go to the public markets. And they said, well, you've never done this before. You should hire a telecom CEO. And I wasn't opposed to that. I said, okay, I'll become chairman, and ran a process. I actually had 2 RBOC CEOs competing for the job. So I had Dave Dorman, who was CEO of Nexttel at the time, Pac Bell. And then I had Dick Jalcott, who was CEO of 9X.
Yeah.
I ultimately
Two
chose...
big names in the industry.
Oh, yeah.
In that era, and for years thereafter too. I mean, these were kind of...
Oh, yeah. Dave went
these
on to be CEO of AT&T.
Yep.
And Dick went on to run TPX, Telepacific. And ultimately hired Dick. I had a weird role. I was chairman and CFO. We ultimately didn't get the equity done, and Dick and I did not get along. I actually exited after that by selling my position in a secondary to a fund of funds that had invested in my VCs. So I did a private sale of what was a failed IPO.
Yeah, because, I mean, you as chairman and CFO, I mean, you are about as hands-on as... I was pretty hands-on. You were hands-on beyond, I think, the level I was hands-on. So the thought that there'd be some, especially Arbach, kind of CEO coming in and being CEO, I mean, I can't imagine.
It was oil
the chemistry
and water. It did not mix.
Yeah.
But anyhow, I was able to exit, and then literally came in. I exited probably, let me see, it would have been 99 in like March. And then I came in to the office in the first week of August, was actually August 9th. And I literally wrote the Cogent business plan on one Saturday afternoon.
So what happened at Pathways?
Pathnet.
Pathnet. How come I didn't even know about? Is it
Pathnet?
Pathnet.
Path. P-A-T-H.
Pathnet. Yeah.
So
because Pathnet I know about, but Pathnet I don't remember the name at all.
Some of the assets. So the fiber route between Denver and Chicago got sold off. I think you ended up actually buying a piece.
Yes,
of it.
I did end up buying a piece of it.
Pathnet built that.
Okay.
The route between Albuquerque and Colorado Springs was sold to... It was after I was gone, so I'm not sure who bought that. A couple of the other systems were sold off in pieces.
Yep. And I assume most of that debt had to go through bankruptcy.
Oh, yeah. It ultimately got flushed out.
Yeah.
And I was long gone. I had exited, and it was almost 2 years later when they filed for bankruptcy. And Cogent was already up and going. So I came in August of 99, wrote the Cogent business plan, and that I did it on Saturday. Monday, I literally picked up the phone and called a guy at Morgan Stanley who was a third-year banking analyst. So he was the guy who took me around on the road show. And a really nice young guy. And he said, if you ever do anything else, I really would like to work with you. And he wanted to get a year of operations on his resume before he went to business school. So I called him up and said, I wrote a business plan. I'm starting a new business. You want to join me? I'll pay out of my pocket. And he said, yeah, my tour duty is going to be up in a month here at Morgan Stanley. And he says, do you mind if I have a young lady who also would like to do the same thing? She was actually at Anderson Consulting, and the two of us would like to come and help you raise capital. And I said, sure, that's fine. We were in an office half the size of this conference room with a PowerPoint, and I went around pitching people, and that's when I actually pitched John Siegel at Morgan Stanley Capital Partners. That's where I first met him.
Year 2000?
This would have been fall of 99.
Fall 99. So you were doing this before the
crash.
The crash.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so I always had my notion that you did this right after the crash.
No. So the Cogent business plan.
By the way, I wanted to include Cogent in the book, but I could not find much information about Cogent out there. I couldn't find enough to piece together what really happened. And I wasn't calling around and asking people because there was so much information to work with. The last thing I need is more. But the whole Cogent story is, which we're about to get into, should be more prominently featured in the book Bandwidth because of what you were able to do.
I don't know about that, but Cogent.
I do.
Cogent. I'm not a believer in press releases. We do what's mandated by law, but no other press releases. And, we try to stay under the radar to the best of our ability. There's no upside in, announcing your strategy to the rest of the world. And
it kind of worked for Zayo. So I would say there's a lot of upside in,
I agree with
investing $1 billion and actually for $8.5 billion on the equity side. But
that's a very good outcome.
So there's more than one path to,
I'm a little more press averse.
Yeah, you're a little more low key. You're like roll up the sleeves, get the work done, outsmart everyone else, outwork everyone else too, which is a noble way of doing it.
Anyhow, so we did, we wrote the business plan. I went on the road and I actually had 2 competing term sheets to do $500 million in the fall of 99. One was from a single fund. The other was from a consortium of 10 funds. And I ultimately chose the consortium deal. They put the capital in, and it was expected that we would need to raise $2 billion. So the original business plan was to go out and buy a single fiber, not a pair, nationwide network, run bidirectional DWDM, connect to the 13 major North American cities, and then build a series of rings using single fiber, all acquired through IRUs, and then build an IP over DWDM network protected at layer 3 using Ethernet as the interface and productized solely to deliver internet.
Which, to put in perspective, in 1999, that was a very novel idea, right? I mean, that was just not...
I was laughed out of most VCs.
Yeah. Yet, if you look at how networks are run today, it's all Ethernet, all IP, leveraging DWM systems. So what you conceived at that time was very unique, very novel. Like you said, got laughed out of most VCs, but turned out to be kind of the right path forward.
Well, one of our investors turned out to be Cisco as an equity investor. First is debt, and then we equitize our position. But I remember going to Cisco met with John Chambers. It was actually the largest CLEC investment they had ever made. Met with Larry Carter, was the CFO at the time, Mike Volpe, who was running strategy. And I go into their executive briefing center, and there's probably 20 Cisco executives in there. And I go up on the whiteboard, and I start drawing out the Cogent network and some diagrams of how it would be tied together. And I hear this laughing in the background. And I turn around, and it was actually Caruso, who went on to be the CEO of Calix. And Carl ran Cerent, which got sold to Cisco and was the core of their optical strategy along with Pirelli. And I'm in there, and Don Listwin's in the meeting, all these big Cisco executives, Tony Bates, who ran the routing business, Graham Fraser, a lot of the early guys were at Cisco at the beginning. And they said, "You can't do that." And I literally turned around and said, well, one of two things is true. Either I can do it, or the specifications that I'm writing on this board all came from your marketing materials and you guys are lying. But if your equipment can do what the spec says, we will be able to build this network and it will function and carry traffic. And
lots of traffic.
Lots of traffic.
By the traffic standards of that day.
Bigger than any other network.
Yeah, plenty of capacity to do all kinds of futuristic things.
Yeah, so the original system was designed around a 4-channel, 2.5 gig per channel DWDM system. Eventually, that grew. And people laughed at me that I only wanted one fiber because no one had ever bought just a single fiber. They always bought them in pairs running unidirectional amplification. And you could actually use splitters and run your colors in a way that it functioned as a 2-fiber system on a single fiber.
But was the laughing from the back of the room because of the bidirectional, or was it, what was the nature of what they said this is
I think it was
crazy?
the whole thing. It was eliminating the ATM and TDM layers. It was relying entirely on the routers for 3R functionality. It was scaling it using OSPF at the edge and ISIS at the core for protection. And it was effectively a corporate land on a global scale.
Yeah.
And no one had ever, even in a lab, done anything like that.
And plus, here's this guy in front of all the Cisco executives drawing a whiteboard who spent 17 years in the taxicab business with some real estate properties,
little bit
dabbled in
SMR.
Spectrum, and now you're there in front of the top optical company in the world, top
Most
router
valuable company in the world.
Oh, they were the most valuable at that time in the world.
First company to hit $500 billion in market cap.
And here you're telling them how to design a network that looks unlike any other network out there.
So I got a lucky break. So they actually took my design, and at their analyst day, which was held at the San Jose Convention Center, they actually put Cogent's network up and said, we're backing the network of the future, and this is it. And they took my name off of it. But it really
And here we're tolling around at level 3 building all these conduits because we're going to need all this fiber across everywhere. And you're saying, hey, I just want one of those fibers. And
just one strand. And you have to look at it and look at the optical throughput on that fiber. It is, in an RF system, you have millions of users using about 100 megahertz of spectrum. And a single strand of fiber, you have thousands of terahertz, 9 orders of magnitude more throughput. Today we are limited to the EDFA band, CL and S, and we still have more bandwidth than we need on a single fiber. And the reality is, other than the water peak at 1310 nanometers, the rest of that glass is usable with different types of amplifiers. It's just nobody's built them because there's no commercial need for them. And people put too much glass in the ground. But my idea was to use the physical layer as efficiently as possible. I ended up meeting with the MFN guys when they were MFN, before they were above net, actually before Bill LaPerche was there, when John Gertelman was there. And I said, I just want one fiber. I actually did meet Steve Garofalo. And I know you said you didn't meet him in the book. He's a very interesting guy. He could have played Tony Soprano better than Tony Soprano paid it.
I've got to get him to come on the podcast if he's still in a position.
I think he's still alive. And I don't, something you didn't mention in the book. I don't know if you knew Howard Finkelstein was John Kluge's son-in-law.
No, I did not realize he was son-in-law.
He ultimately got divorced from John's daughter, but he was his son-in-law. That's why he was put in. And he had the title of COO, but he was effectively the CEO. Steve was not involved in the day-to-day operations.
Yep. Yeah, no, I definitely realized that once they got involved.
Yeah, but he, and people thought I was crazy asking for just one fiber, but we started to build ultimately, it turned out it was better to use two, and we switched to a unidirectional amplified system. And that was Cogent's model till we bought Sprint, never to build, only to buy fiber. And, we've bought fiber from a total of 363 different suppliers. Zayo is one, and a very significant one, but it was a very eclectic pool of potential suppliers.
Yeah, and your business focus, as I understood it, was by being very narrowly focused on, we're going to provide, well, it was really two product lines. One was more on the wholesale internet. So,
same product, two different customer bases.
Two different customer bases, but one of the products was lots of bandwidth, lots of internet access. In fact, I shouldn't even call it bandwidth, because in your case, it was really internet access. Mm-hmm. So one that was geared more toward big wholesale that needed a ton of internet access, and other was more retail, corporate clients, where you would get fiber into a building and make sure that you then got as much of the market share of that building as you could get on both ends of that spectrum. So choose your buildings that had typically multiple tenants,
big
buildings, master the risers of the building. How do you get around that building? How do you get in front of the customers? How to offer the service in a way that it was more compelling than using the incumbent options that were available, but know every detail, know how to price in order to win the business, know how to master the micro cost structure associated with each situation. It was really taking all the experience and your intellect and turning that into kind of a business focus that was like no other in our industry.
Yeah, we have been orthogonal to other providers. We started selling service in 2002 with literally one product, internet access, and you bought it two ways. You either bought a dedicated fixed connection of 100 megabits a second, non-block, non-oversubscribed, symmetric service in a multi-tenant office building, or you bought a metered service in a data center on a wholesale basis. But it was the same product. And for the next 4 years, that's all we ever sold. Now, we then expanded the model to include selling VPN services, first using rapid spanning tree, then pivoting to VPLS and MPLS. We then expanded further into co-location, running data centers, much like your zColo business. We also expanded into IP leasing because of the acquisition of about 38 million IPv4 addresses. And then finally, our most recent product expansion is wavelength services off of the Sprint network. And, Cogent never expected to do M&A. That's a common misunderstanding. The idea was that we would go out and build this network by acquiring fiber, deploying Cisco gear on it, and have a direct sales force, no agents, no channel partners, and sell directly into that market, winning on value. And a little thing called the .com crash and the telecom meltdown changed those plans. And I will never forget, in April of 2001, I called a meeting of my board and my investors. Not every investor had a board seat. All 10 funds came. And one of the lessons I learned early on was businesses get in trouble. And I insisted on a strange request. Only the managing partner of the fund could be the representative on Cogent. Anyone else in the firm, I wouldn't take your money. Maybe I was arrogant, but I was just anticipating things not going as planned. So I called this meeting. It's now April of 2001. The crashes have occurred. We have a pile of cash. we started to build a network. We bought IRUs from Williams 2. We bought MFN, and we had a few other smaller suppliers. And if you remember, our first interaction, Dan, was on a phone call when you were buying Indiana Fiber Works. And we had a pending IRU with them. But what ended up happening was
Was it a good phone call?
it was a constructive call by the end. We're still friends. Let's leave it at that.
were we unfriends at that point? I don't recall that.
You wanted to not sell us the dark fiber under the terms that we already had an LOI on. You thought the Indiana guys had signed too good a deal for Cogent.
Well, I think we were signed to good deals with Cogent, and I somewhat regretted how generous we were at times. But
well, Jim always regretted that after he bought Williams. He told me that, he allowed us to destroy the transit market. Mm-hmm. And, my answer to him was, we didn't destroy it. You didn't pursue it.
Yes.
But I sat down with my 10 investors in that April meeting, and I said, there are 3 paths forward. Path number 1, let's just go home. We'll liquidate. There's $450 million. We'll split the money up. We'll go home. Well, none of the investors liked that answer because I owned 23% of the company and only put in $7 million. They had put in $500 and owned the remainder.
And they didn't have the preference.
Well, we had equal. I had full anti-dilution ratchet, full liquidation preferences, and full dividend preferences. So I was co-equal to actually, my rights were slightly superior to theirs. I'd learned a lot of lessons about taking institutional capital.
For the Caruso Ventures team, including Gib, who's here with us, getting into nitty-gritty detail on how deal terms work, both in deals you're already in, you've seen us do a little bit of this, but trying to teach the team, you got to understand it and iterate and, really read and really evaluate. This isn't go give it to a lawyer and they give you their summary. It's like, where are you vulnerable? Where do you have kind of advantage? And make sure you know how to use that in your favor. I mean, so much value gets created or lost
destroyed
in that dynamic.
Well, I learned that in Pathnet. I had, sale rights and preemptive rights that allowed me to sell when the VCs couldn't sell, which they hate, because they ended up with a zero for their $36 million investment, and I ended up making about $36 million. So it was, the documents do matter. Anyhow, path 1 was liquidation. Path 2, which was the interesting conversation, I pulled out a white notepad. I always keep a white notepad of my to-do list. And I said, look, 10 of you here at the table, I'm going to pass this pad around, and I want everyone to write down how much they're in for, because nobody else will give us money. This is April of 2001. And I'll never forget Dave Bonderman from TPG was sitting directly opposite me at the long end of the table. And he stands up and he says, are you a lunatic or what? And I said, no, I'm just doing my job. We've already rejected the liquidation option. I have to ask. He says, I can tell you right now, TPG's not in for a penny. And of course, Oak and JVP and Worldview and all the other.
And was it Bandel at Oak?
No, it was Ed, actually, Ed Glassmeyer.
Ed Glassmeyer.
Yeah, because, Ed founded Oak.
Yeah.
And Bandel was the first new partner other than there was him and Jerry Greenfield founded it. And then they ended up bringing the guy in Minneapolis. I forget his name. He's passed on, the restaurant guy.
And that you almost tanked Zayo.
I've heard that.
Going.
I don't think I did. I've heard that. I don't believe.
Well, I know my information secondhand as well, but the person who knows it firsthand is who I'm having dinner with tonight, which is Jim Fleming. So the story that Jim told at the time was, because they were all committed, everyone's committed, but we're like, until we get a deal, there's no need for anyone to sign dotted line. I had already built a relationship with Columbia and with MC. We were so close. I didn't feel the need to kind of, get anything in final written form until we found the deal we wanted to do. And Oak was always behind the scenes. They weren't, they were never meeting with us. In fact, I think I met him once. So when we went to do our first deal, Oak tried to pull out, even though there was kind of a very firm handshake that we were proceeding forward, and they were just going to fall in line with letting Columbia take the lead. And it was Bandel talking to Ed talking to you. Now, maybe he didn't talk to you. Maybe he was just using his experiences from Cogent.
So what happened was there was actually another partner, a guy named David Black, who was a venture partner behind the scenes, who actually sat with Bandel. I'd met Bandel a number of times. Actually, before Ed made the investment, he made me do a video conference call with Bandel. And I'll never forget, Ed sent a limo to pick me up in the city, take me out to Westport to do the call, and it took me back because he had a video set up there. So technology has changed. But what happened was David Black, who was a venture partner, not an investing partner, had been tasked with finding fiber opportunities. He called me up and said, we're getting ready to do this deal on an acquisition. And he asked me point blank, why is Cogent not doing it? Because I had capital. And I said 3 things. 1, it's a deviation from my business, and I think that would be a mistake. 2, I think it's too expensive. And 3, it's not clear to me building fiber is the best strategy. Buying fiber is a better strategy. So, it was with David Black, who then reported to Bandel, who reported to Ed. Ed then called me and said, well, we're doing this thing, this really clever entrepreneur. Do you know him, Dan Caruso? And I said, no, I know of him, but I've never met him. And he's out to roll up a number of fiber assets. What do you think about that? And I said, if you buy them at the right price, it'll make sense, but you got to have tremendous buying discipline. And I used the example of someone James Henry from Bank Street. So if you remember, when James and Rich left Bear Stearns, they actually started a fund called Greenlight Capital.
Yep.
And they had raised over $100 million to do distressed telecom purchases. The problem is every investment they made was distressed, but not distressed enough, and they overpaid and ended up liquidating, not returning capital, and starting an investment bank, which has been extremely successful. But, a mistake that you can't ever recover from is overpaying in an acquisition. And, my answer to Ed was, I didn't think it was cheap enough. Now, I don't know if that tanked sale, but that was my opinion.
Well, they did say they were pulling out before.
But they came back.
Yeah, and they came back with Fleming putting pressure on them like, you're not signed, but you're committed. And he said, this will work out. So do you know how it worked out for Oak?
It was a great investment for Oak.
So they ended up being the biggest investor, so $65 million roughly in. And I think when they exited, they probably took out, maybe 14 times that amount. So what would that be? You're the better math guy.
About $1.1 billion.
Yeah, so they probably took out close to $1 billion, maybe a little bit more. So I think it's their best performing investment in the history of their fund, which during sale kind of went. It was a 40-year run they had. So, but Zayo wouldn't have existed if they would have pulled out, because if they had pulled out, the whole construct of the deal would have not allowed us to proceed forward. We probably would have figured something else out.
Oh, yeah.
But it would have been a different path, and who knows if we,
Again, I'm just being candid. I didn't say don't invest. I just said it was too expensive for me.
Yeah, and that was an interesting time because the best time to buy was really 2 or 3 years prior to when Zayo got started. It's when we did ICG. That's when the real distressed deals, like if you were buying there, you would have bought at the bottom in the 2000, what would that have been, 2003, 2004, 2005 timeframe. That was, those deals were the most compelling, most interesting. By the time we got going on it, it was more like, hey, there's still this window of opportunity to gather. At that point, they were much better assets. I mean, the businesses mostly were being run much better. They were producing cash. They were growing. So you weren't buying distressed businesses. You were buying decent businesses that had a bunch of untapped asset potential underneath them. But we were paying like 8 times EBITDA, 9 times EBITDA, which is not all that different than what you would buy some of the assets for. Now maybe it's 11 times as opposed to 9 times. But that was interesting, and it was scary because all we were working for almost collapsed.
We were paid to take the companies we bought.
Oh, I know.
So
that's what I mean. You go back. I mean, shit. When we bought Columbia Capital, I give them a huge amount of credit. MC Ventures as well. But when we bought ICG, we gave, it cost us $8.7 million. None of that went into the business. It all went to buying their public stock, paying lawyers, doing workout deals. But basically everything else, we didn't put a dime into, and turned out to be worth a whole bunch of money. So that was the big one of opportunity when you look backwards. But you have to be really brave, which you were, to be buying when other people, couldn't.
Well, and we had a distinct use for what we bought. So what happened was, in that board meeting, no one agreed to put another dime in. But what I did is I said, there is a third path. I will actually agree to sign a subordination agreement that subordinates my equity to everyone in this room and lets you guys get out before I take a dime. And in exchange, you have to give me the cash as a blind pool to go out and do M&A. You can have review, but I need to have discretion. We looked at 121 targets between April of 2001 and December of 2004. We bid on 19. We were successful in buying 13 companies. Those 13, 6 were public. At peak, the 6 publics had a market cap of $61 billion.
Can you read off the companies?
Yeah, PSINet, Allied Riser, Vario, Carrier One, LambdaNet, FirstMark, Applied Theory, On-Site Access, Fiber Network Solutions, AINet, Global Access. I'm sure I'm missing a couple in there. Allied Riser. And we, in total, paid $60 million. We actually acquired $115 million of cash. We acquired 400 of preferences, 500 of debt, and we acquired companies that had $14 billion of invested capital, $4 billion of PP&E on their balance sheet. And then we crammed down the preferences, crammed down the debt in some really complicated, and I'm happy to walk through them, transactions, and then ended up tearing those businesses apart. We fired the customers, we fired the employees, and then we repurposed a subset of the assets to build Cogent, and then sold off the stuff we didn't need, and built the original Cogent out of the piece parts of those acquisitions. I remember describing it to the board. I said, it's like an erector set. It was put together one way, you tore it apart and built a different configuration, but it's the same erector set. And that's all we did. And most outside...
Who was we? Who were... That's also something that's been kind of mysterious with how you've done things is Like who have been your go-to people over all these years? Who's helped you do all of this crazy stuff?
So we never used an investment banker. We did everything internal. My team is very stable. I mean, today, my direct reports have an average tenure of 22 years.
Oh, God.
You know, they're just been here a long time. I didn't have an M&A guy. I just did it myself, figured it out. And usually would sit down with the counterparty and figure out what it was going to take to get a deal done.
Yeah, I'm glad I was never on the opposite side of the table of you, because you would have run circles around me.
Not at all.
Well, you're able to see things and understand things that, next level up levels. I consider myself pretty good at that stuff too.
You're a smart guy.
But the stuff I've done, the counterparties have been equally smart guys and, guys, gals. I mean, I don't view there to have been a gap there, but in your case, I think you really do have, an ability to go deeper, understand things deeper, work harder, but also bring more intellect to the table and serve you well, serve your team well.
Yeah, team has really been a great team, and we've come a long way. And, in each case, we had a very specific roadmap of what we were doing. And, for each counterparty, we were able to solve the problem that they were dealing with. And it was different in every deal.
So you've been through some big battles too, which I only have a hazy memory of, where, shutting down kind of internet peering between, I can't remember if it was you and Level 3 or was
AOL, France Telecom, Deutsche Telekom.
So what were those all about? Remind me, because I was there at the time, but I wasn't involved. I was working on other stuffs. So I didn't really understand what was going on when that was happening at Level 3.
Yeah. So the internet works with a bill and keep model, which is different than telecom settlements. And at the very beginning of the internet, everybody peered with everybody. But the problem with that model is it incents free rider behavior. Someone with no network peers with you and can say free ride. John Sidgmore had been brought in to work for Rick Adams. He was actually the second CEO. The first guy was Mike Anderson, who only lasted a couple of months. And actually, Peter Barris brought him in. And Peter was actually, at the time, not a partner at NEA. He was a consultant. Peter had worked for Art Marks at Geis, and Art was a partner, and John was a peer of Peter's. And I actually knew John socially, not through telecom. And anyhow, John decided to create this tiering hierarchy of peering. And he said, we're going to peer with 20 networks that are big, and everybody else has to buy transit to get to us. Now, they don't have to buy from me, but they have to buy from somebody. And included in that were the first 8 original peers that made up the internet when it was first privatized, with PSINet being the first commercial internet provider. So it is true, Genuity had AS1, but the lowest commercial AS is AS174, and it's the one that we operate today. And PSINet was the first company to pass a bit on the ARPANET that then immediately became the internet when it was commercial for profit. And so we had this radical model of pricing, and we got into the peering club by buying peers, which pissed people off, including Sprint, ironically, de-peered us. And, each time we had a sufficient amount of internet traffic and enough high-profile customers that, losing that portion of the internet was too painful for the counterparty. And we became the most interconnected network in the world.
But the game of chicken you were playing at that point, because it was very disruptive to your customers as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I hated doing it.
Yeah.
But we had a right that we acquired. And as soon as we acquired it, the counterparty tried to take it away because of what we were going to do with that right. And it was just bad behavior. And sometimes you have to stand up for what's right.
Yep. Okay. So, and you've made your way through all those. Bring us up to the Sprint deal, because that had been being, T-Mobile was trying to solve that for a long time. It was a hard thing to solve for. I know I think I looked at it a few times within the context of Zayo, the last couple of years of Zayo, and just couldn't see a way forward. And frankly, I couldn't see a way forward under Zayo, because Zayo at that point, we weren't, if it was Zayo 6 years prior to that, 7 years prior to that, we'd have been all over that, because we didn't know exactly what to do. We all knew how each other thinked and behaved. So we kind of had a playbook. For most of the people that I relied on in the first decade of Zayo, they made so much money when we went public that they want to go off and do different things, and maybe kind of, we were all working really hard. But that Zayo was no longer. So I thought that we'd be able to go in there and kind of really dissect the situation, shut down what needed to be shut down, repurpose what needed to be repurposed, and really understand it at the level of detail. I think that's where you and I share in common to really extract value out of some of these assets. The level of detail you have to get into was the key between having a really good outcome and a really decisive outcome versus how most acquisitions typically go bad. And I just didn't, think we would know what we were even buying, let alone have the wherewithal to figure out what to do with it. But at the same time, knew we could they'd pretty much give it to us if we were willing to figure it out. But you went forward and did it. You went forward to figure out a deal that largely didn't cost you guys anything up front, got a bunch of assets, but there's a lot of complications associated with that. So, how did that come about? How did you decide to take that on? And how's it going for you guys?
So our original attempt to buy Sprint actually goes back to 2013. So Joe Utenauer was the CFO of Sprint. Joe had formerly been the CFO of XM Radio. He went on to be the CFO of Mattel Toys, and Joe's daughter is here in DC. She's a pediatric surgeon. And I had known Joe for a while, and Joe had brokered the deal after the failed Sprint Nexttel merger to sell 85% of Sprint to SoftBank. And Joe calls me up and said, Masa has no interest in the wireline business. I thought of you as a good fit. And I said, I'd be very interested.
So I got the same phone call in that period as well. So we were looking at it as early as that period.
So I flew out to KC, met with Dan and Joe and Steve Elfman and Bob Azadi, who ran Network. And we had a couple of good meetings. And then I actually flew out to San Mateo and met Masa. Very positive, very unique meeting. Very interesting individual. I'll just leave it at that. One of the most unique individuals I've met in my career. He then says, well, you got to meet my partner in Boston, Ron Fisher, who, because this is a North American asset, will be key to making a decision. Fly up to Boston, meet with Ron. Very good meeting. Masa's office calls me and says, now Masa wants to meet you again with Ken and the SoftBank team in Tokyo. So I fly over to Tokyo, go meet with Masa. Office is identical to the San Mateo office. Grass mats, geisha serving us on the floor. Surreal experience. And Masa and I shake hands on a deal. So I get up, I'm getting ready to leave, and he says, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to the airport to go home." He says, "No, you're not. You're going to stay here, and you and I are going to do a press conference to announce the deal tomorrow." I said, "Hold on. I've done no due diligence. I'm a public company and I have no board approval." And he looks at me and says, "Real entrepreneurs don't worry about things like that." I didn't know what to say to the guy. I just said, "I got to go." I left, came back, had a board meeting that weekend, was in KC with the team. On Monday, we were there a full week and did due diligence. And then Masa just lost interest. He went on to something else, and the deal never happened. Fast forward now to 2019. T-Mobile buys Sprint, does not want the wireline business. Peter Ewings, who runs strategy, or did run strategy at the time, long time, T-Mobile person. He was the one who did the AT&T deal that failed and did the Metro PCS deal. Very, very long tenure. Very, very smart guy, ex-McKinsey guy. Ran a process, hired a bank, guys TAP, Davis Terry, and we put in a bid. Others did, and they rejected everybody's bid. I said, "Okay, they don't like my bid. That's fine." They then hire a consultant to fix the business, invest $10 million, 6 months, and give up. They hire a second consultant to shut the business down. They actually start to shut it down, and Peter gives the mandate to a different bank, Houlihan Lokey, a guy named Chris Wilson, who runs TMT banking there. And I had met Chris when he was a junior person on the Allied Riser acquisition 20 years earlier, and I hadn't talked to him in 20 years. And I remember the last time I talked to him, he called me names I wouldn't say on a podcast and was screaming and shouting at me because I screwed him out of his fee. And I said, "Look, I didn't draft the engagement letter. You did. I acquired the company. I took the cash, and I'm honoring the 4 quarters of the engagement." Oh, he called me every name in the book. So literally, I get a teaser, I ignore it. I get another teaser, I ignore it. And I get a phone call. I just picked it up. It was a 310 number. And he says, "This is Chris Wilson." I have to admit, I didn't quite remember. I had to think about it for a minute. I said, "Oh, yeah. I said, "You're not calling me about the fee, are you?"
From years earlier.
20 years earlier. I said, No. That's water under the bridge. He says, "You should be looking at Sprint." And I said, "Look, I've wasted my time twice. I got better things to do with my life." And he says, "It's different this time. They're serious." And I listened to him, and he goes through it. And what got my attention? He says, "They're going to write a check." I said, "You got my attention now."
Yeah, that's the kind of you like.
Yeah, and I said, "Okay." So I flew out to KC again. I flew to Seattle. I met with the team in Northern Virginia. And we pretty much had a deal in about 3 weeks. And the deal was really 2 deals. Deal number 1 was taking over their services business to enterprise customers that was doing $565 million in revenue, but negative $300 million of EBITDA and $30 million of CapEx, and declining at 12% a year, with a bunch of really bad contracts and 93% of revenues off net. And I was paid $700 million to take that business and run it off. They agreed to spend $500 million pre-closing to implement a number of changes. They gave us $100 million indemnification, another $25 million for severance. So from their view, they got speed and certainty, and it cost them $1.3 billion versus $1.5 billion. So it was a win. From Cogent's perspective, they de-risked it, and then they sold us the network for $1. And the network included 19,000 route miles of intercity, dark fiber, all direct buried under rail track, 1,200 route miles of metro fiber, and 482 fee simple owned pieces of real estate that comprised 1.9 million square feet and 230 megawatts of power. So I got that pile of stuff for $1. And we've been busily focused on repurposing those assets.
Well, if I had the energy that I had 10 years ago, I'd have been all over that. Because that, it's repurposing and extracting value. I mean,
it's hard work. You've done it. You know how
it's hard work, but it's fulfilling. We used to, in fact, it was with Columbia Capital and MC. We used to have, when we were doing ICG, we would have first weekly, then monthly kind of, telephonic board meetings. And we retitled them to "What Have You Done For Me Lately?" Because every time we'd meet, we'd find something to monetize of value. We'd find a piece of land that they didn't know they owned, a building that, they were paying a lot of money for, but the lease had expired, or whatever the case would be. And it was like every time we'd come forward with, either, unexpected benefits to the burn rate, bringing it down by getting out of what they thought were obligations, or extracting value from assets that they thought were just, more obligations than valuable assets. And well, I'm sure you're having a field day with that kind of stuff nowadays.
Shelby was more worried about what party to go to in the Hamptons.
Yes, he
Vera
was.
Wang was his wife.
Yes.
Than he was worried with running ICG.
That is true. Okay, so let's look forward, and here's where you have to help me out a little bit, because the reason I'm out here in the Northeast is I'm going to present at the Comcast Business Analyst Day in a couple days from now. And at first I thought, I'll just tell like the bandwidth story and this and that. And they're like, no, we want you to talk about the future. Like the future. Okay, I'm not sure I know the future from the perspective of Comcast Business. So tell me what Comcast Business, what their future is like, and what should be most top of mind to investors of Comcast Business.
Well, I remember seeing you present at MetroConnect one year when you had the George Jetson car flying around
yes.
on the screen. The future isn't great for Comcast, business or otherwise. Listen, they've got a great cash cow, but they've got a lot of structural challenges, and they have an innovator's dilemma. The cable companies confuse being entrepreneurs with being competitive. They are not competitive. They are monopolists. And they act like that. They've attempted to get into business in their footprint for small business where they can distribute in their normal model. They've captured share. But now that there's a significant amount of residential overbuild of fiber going on, and they're stuck with an HFC plant, they've got the wrong network, the wrong marketing strategy, the wrong market share, and the wrong cost structure. They're not going bankrupt. The Robertsons run a great business, but they have structural challenges, and they've not been able to address them. The future is about dumb pipes, about commoditized business. And, probably the biggest application that will drive the next wave of value will actually be AI over the internet. AI exists because of the internet, and AI will power the next leg up in internet traffic growth. So it is a virtuous circle. And it's not clear to me that Comcast, with that monopolist mindset, is willing to take the risks and deliver the value they need to.
So let's talk about AI at the edge. So most of the big boosts in AI in the recent year or two has been fiber in particular, maybe fiber and bandwidth, but fiber in particular to kind of remote data centers, which are being built up on power grids. So, data center investments off the charts, but the need for fiber routes to get those data centers has led to monetization opportunities for Lumen, has led to opportunities for Zayo. But the future wave is going to be more distributed. So more distributed where more AI activity is taking place in kind of, population centers, maybe business centers. How do you see AI affecting opportunities for your business at the edge and for other businesses at the edge?
So AI is technology that's misnamed. It's not artificial intelligence. It's pattern development and projection out of large data sets. AI exists because the internet collected 800 zettabytes of data that could be used for large language model training. Unfortunately, the power needed to do that training was not where the data was, so there was a need for fiber connectivity, and that's driven wavelength and dark fiber demand. That is going to continue. Large language models are evolving at the rate of about every 4 months. There's a new version, and you can retrain the same data multiple times to get better and better answers, better neural networks. And that rate of change is actually going to accelerate. The output of that training is a neural network that then is applied to a different set of data to create an outcome. So the better name for what AI is software 3.0. Software 1.0 existed between 1945 and 1975, and it was all about computation. Software 2.0 existed for 50 years, and it was millions of people writing tens of billions of lines of code that has made every aspect of society process quantifiable and made us much more efficient. That model is run out of steam. What AI is going to do to the software industry is what the internet did to telecom. It's going to destroy it. And what is going to happen is those neural networks will be applied to very custom data sets that will allow for very agile and specific processes that fit the exact fact pattern you're dealing with that'll make us much more efficient. And that is going to happen over the internet. So you've got two things driving internet growth. The value of the data increasing because you can do more training off of it. And two, the output that comes out of that training will be distributed. And, the internet has gone through 5 discrete phases of growth. The most recent one was streaming, the conversion of video consumption from linear to streaming. Now we're at a 6th wave of growth that is going to come from AI driving specific applications at the edge.
And do you think at the edge there'll be the connectivity needs and the quantity of bandwidth is going to materially grow as a result of that? Or do you think it will be absorbed?
So the entire world, developed world, will be fiber overbuilt. It will probably destroy capital for the people that funded it, and the consumers will be the beneficiaries. Along the way, it'll destroy traditional telecom companies. Once you have the fiber connectivity, it's not clear that the data has to sit at the edge. It doesn't have to sit in a remote data center, but it has to sit in multiple locations. I do think it will increase the number of minutes of use a day that people use the internet, and the bit intensity per minute will go up. And AI won't be a standalone thing. it'll be ingrained in everything we do. So if you want to watch a movie, AI will pick the movie. It'll actually create the plot for you in the movie. If you want to order a car, it will do the comparison shopping. It will optimize the options, the location. It'll do all of the process that you would have to do on your own. Some of that data will be centralized, some will be edge, but it'll all come by overlaying these patterns against data sets that are specific to the task in front of them.
Yeah. And how much will proximity matter? How much will, for some of the applications, the amount of elapsed time to get from, where the use case is and where the data is will matter. Maybe it's
very little.
Very little. So
this was the whole, we're going to build data centers at the base of cell towers. We're going to all have all this distributed 5G small cell, which you were smart enough not to pursue.
We pursued it more than we should have in hindsight, but
you were a skeptic. You and I had that conversation. Yeah. And, latency does matter, but there are two views of the world. You could take the Google view of the world, that data is valuable and networks are worthless. And in that case, you'd have one giant data center with the entire knowledge of the world sitting in a cornfield in Kansas, and everyone would go in and out of it. It'd be the FedEx of data. The other view of the world is kind of the Seagate Apple view, which is every phone will come preloaded with the entire knowledge base of the world on it. Well, that's not realistic. The truth lies in between. But there are very few applications that are that latency sensitive. And as it turns out, globally, if you build 30 large data centers and about 300 intermediate data centers, you solve that problem. And every hyperscaler has that architecture. So it's a big world out there. 300 data centers, say 75 of them in the U.S., that's far from being an edge data center. It's just distributed.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you're going to Baltimore or if you're going to D.C., if you're sitting here in Alexandria with an AI query.
What about quantum? Have you started to understand kind of how quantum is going to affect things?
Quantum is really interesting. It is not ready for prime time, and it is not clear that it will be ready for prime time. In theory, it should. In reality, the physical material science challenges have been much more daunting. Just like fusion reactors are theoretically possible. My undergrad work was in plasma physics. But, the reality is, building a containment vessel for fusion in the real world is a really hard problem. And I think quantum suffers from that. It clearly allows for much faster computing. I tend to think that'll end up being solved with more, not silicon, but more physical chip transistor-based models. So the issue is, to beat Moore's law, you've got two things. You can increase clock speed when you generate too much heat, and you can reduce your traces. We're down to 3 nanometers. That's the thickness of a silicon atom. It ain't going any lower. So Moore's law as it exists is running out of steam. You can massively parallel things together, which is kind of what NVIDIA is trying to do. I think probably the more realistic breakthrough will be 3-dimensional lithography for chip construction, which will allow you to dramatically increase the transistor density in a way that will still scale. I hope quantum works. I'm just skeptical of the material science challenges it has.
Yeah. And as you probably know, Boulder is a sweet spot for quantum. There's been 8 Nobel Prizes awarded in quantum. 4 have come out of literally Boulder itself. And there's multiple companies that have been commercialized there. They're all all of them are doing well, as evidenced by kind of fundraising activity that's taken place at higher valuations, which in the VC
That's
world is
different
kind
than
of rare.
making money.
Oh yeah, as you and I both know, but it's certainly you see that activity. Sometimes it leads to a path where things get ahead of themselves. Sometimes there's no path where a new meaningful technology takes place where you don't see that activity, at this stage. So it's not enough all by itself, but it's a necessary part.
Listen, I hope quantum is real.
Yep.
It's just that.
And I'm not defending the case. The engineering,
I truly hope
engineering
it
is
is
hard,
real.
but there is significant progress being made in multiple different fronts, and quantum isn't just computing. Quantum has big sensing and clocking applications, and it eventually will have communications networking, requirements as well. That I kind of look at this is kind of the stage where the internet was before it was called the internet. It's kind of when ARPANET was becoming the internet. That's where quantum networking is right now. There's going to be some early examples of quantum networks that have very specific purposes. And I think it's going to be timekeeping is going to be the first one of that. But, one thing about quantum computing and the way you described it, this isn't about making computers faster. So it's not like the next type of technology that speeds up computers. It's fundamentally different. It's a different
It's measuring
science.
spin as opposed to state.
Well, it's even more profound than that. It's not based on bits. It's based on qubits. And the qubits,
which are really a derivative of spin in the quantum state.
Spin and other components, yes. But the properties of quantum and how they interact is more than just trying to figure out, does that mean a 1 or does that mean a 0?
Well, it's not a transistor, it's not a switch.
Right. So it goes about solving problems in a way that a traditional computer isn't going to get to a solution ever in many cases.
I agree with that.
So it will lead to when and exactly where and exactly what is yet to be seen. But what will lead to is a fundamentally different world than the one we live in today.
Well, it's a multi-state decision tree as opposed to a binary decision tree. So we grew up before computers in an analog world where everything was contiguous. We got conditioned to a binary world of ons and offs, and quantum takes us to a multi-state world, of 16 or 32 states, and being able to take that into useful computing still has some material science issues.
Oh, for certain. I mean, and even the path forward, there's multiple different ways that might produce kind of a viable path. Well, by definition, it means there's multiple things people are working on that isn't going to prove to be a viable path relative to the others. And yeah, it's just a strange.
Data and VHS.
Data and VHS, with a exponential sign on that. So, anything else that you would have liked to cover?
A lot, Dan. This was great. I appreciate it. Good free.
We spent less time on Cogent than
maybe we'll have a second side.
Oh, the second one, and we'll focus on kind of. I mean, there's so much.
There's a lot of Cogent stories.
Yeah, great Cogent stories, and I have in the back of my mind that at some point I'm going to do a updated version of Bandwidth to bring into it firsthand accounts like we've shared here into the story, because Cogent does need to be part of that whole kind of the what happened after the big crash and the rebuilding of the business. I mean, your story, your story is from it. I kind of mentioned it in there, but without knowing and having kind of source material to understand it better, I couldn't really go into the same level of storytelling. But with your help, I probably could. So maybe we'll do that at some point.
Framing Sam Zell down at Allied Riser, or priming their secured creditors with the unsecured creditors at PSI. These were wild transactions.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, we took over Firstmark, and you had a board that had Burt Roberts, Helmut Kohl, Nathan Myerval, Henry Kravitz, and who else? There was one other Evelyn Rothschild. That was the board. And, we took over that company, and literally right before we took over, all the big names resigned and all the junior partners did the deal. And that was a wild transaction.
Well, we're going to do a part 2 on this one. We've done a part 2 on a couple other ones. This we're going to do part 2, and we're going to go into the nitty gritty of those deals and kind of the stories around them and how you navigate it, and kind of, because each one of those was a story in of its own. So we're going to go to each one of those if you're willing and wanting to. Great. Well, thank you
so much.
Awesome. All right.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Bear Roars. If you enjoyed the episode, please like and subscribe on your listening platform. This podcast was produced by Loud Bear Productions and edited by Courtney Caruso with support from Kendall Weinberg, Emily Reed, and Gibson Seeger.